Okay. I'm walking calling you. Hello?
Hi,
everybody
it's
here?
Ezra. I can hear you perfectly.
Yep, we're all here.
Okay.
Okay, very
The
good.
magic of Zoom. Okay. So
Yeah.
again, I don't know how long connectivity will last,
Right.
but
All right, very
we'll
good.
go for it as long as. Hold on one second. Make this. Can I make this quieter, or does it make a difference?
No.
Okay. So yeah. So let's try to get what we can done. We'll try to have a shorter share probably today. It's this time of year where there's a lot of travel going on. So I guess previously we just would have canceled, and now at least we're making an effort. Anyways, I hope everybody had the last Marmakomos. Last year, of course, was with good. So again, what we've been discussing is various themes in the topic of tzedakah, and we started with Gemara on Daf. This began for us because the Gemara on Daf Chesam Adei is the last. Night. See if changing my position helps. But the concept of kfiyah, our initial foray into the topic was because of the question that Tosas asked, and that is based on the Gemara in Chulin, that tzedakah is a Seder, because the Torah uses the expression in Parshas Re'eh, Leman Yivarechacha Hashem Elokecha, which means the Rebbe Shalom himself promises good reward, or that it will be worthwhile for you to be generous, Pasach Tiftach and Nason Tikein, and therefore there should be no kfiyah. And we examine 6 or 7 different approaches to answering that question, each of which kind of highlights different themes in tzedakah. From there, we went on to analyze various other connected issues in tzedakah, and I want to get back tonight as we kind of conclude this to the question of kfiyah. So what we not examine is the following question. What we didn't have a chance to examine was the following question, and that is how and what form does this kfiyah take place? So here there's a major argument among the Rishonim, which I think we already heard, and then I want to discuss a little bit about what the poskim say about it, and conceptually what its significance is. So let me explain. We find in the world of halacha that there are like 3 different types of kfiyah, of enforcement. Klal Yisrael made a commitment at Har Sinai. They said Na'aseh v'nishma, make a commitment. They made a commitment which wasn't even contingent upon, their comprehension. So, we take very seriously the halakhic norms that were established. Yeah. Yes. Hello. Hello? Yes. Hello.
Hi.
I see you. I don't see you, but I hear you.
Rabbi Roth, we're only going to hear
me?
Rabbi Rosensweig. We're not going to see him this evening.
Right.
He has phoned in. He has not zoomed in.
You know what I mean? Sometimes you can hear, but you can't see. If you can hear, that's good enough.
Right.
So basically, the idea of compelling the performance of mitzvot is something that the Gemara speaks about in Masachet Ketuvot, on Daf Pei Ches Amud Aleph, where the Gemara says, Kofen osal mitzvos haseh. Gemara gives the example of lulav, of sukkah, and of course it would apply to other mitzvos of that kind as well. And the question is, what does that compulsion look like? Most of the Rishonim are of the opinion does not have a monetary component. It means that there can be verbal pressure, maybe it can be physical pressure, but in the end of the day, it stops short of confiscation of property. The exception to that rule is the view of the Maram Rutenberg, which had enormous influence in the world of Ashkenaz. 3, I'm assuming everybody can hear, they can also see the pages that are in front of them. So in the Mar Makomos that were given out, on page 3, I hope everybody has this, is Hagos Maimunios Halacha Aleph, where the Hagos Maimunios quotes a very fascinating psak of the Maram Rutenberg. Posav Maram Zatal, the Kaifinan Le Lalamdam O Liskar Lahem Malamdin. And actually, you can force a parent either to teach his children, to sit down literally and teach them, or to pay tuition, to hire a malamed. And the explanation is very fascinating. Be careful, stay in touch. Where do you keep up? Put a head. Etc. So the Maram Rutenberg suggests that the ability to coerce or to compel the performance of a mitzvah, like teaching your child or paying tuition, is equivalent to the requirement for a lova to repay the malda, priyas balchov mitzvah. That's a bit of a striking position for the Maram Rutenberg to take. Maram Rutenberg was a very supreme authority in the world of Ashkenaz. His impact on, the Germanic Balei Tosas and people like the Rosh, who counted themselves, as his followers, was very profound. And this tshuva of the Maram, which is quoted here, also in the Hagos Mamunios, has far-reaching consequences. He goes on to explain that is the interpretation of the Gemara in Ksuvos. Omar beperaka kosev, the kofino solifroa, mididab yasham mitzvah saseh, kashem sha'av chayiv bibno lamulav liftoso. He compares hiring a teacher to Mila and Pigeon Aben. This is that is compulsory. And that is, of course, an astonishing line. Since this is obligatory, it has the equivalent status of a malva and a lova, of a creditor and a debtor. And the reason, of course, that this is a little bit shocking is because a creditor and a debtor are involved in a monetary relationship. The whole idea is that the creditor extended from his well-earned, money, his material goods, to the lova. He was generous in that regard. He did it without even charging him ribbis, likely. But the whole relationship and the mitzvah is a financial mitzvah, frankly. And therefore, the idea that there's a financial mechanism for compulsion when it comes to repaying that debt is very reasonable. However, if we're talking about building a sukkah, or taking the Daled Minim, or if we're talking about hiring, a teacher for your children, those are not fundamentally economic mitzvos. They're mitzvos. And the economic aspect may be a lever, may be a necessary mechanism for implementation. And therefore, the equation of the Maram Rutenberg of the Gemara in Ksuvos about general mitzvos with the Gemara's discussion about Basra, about Priyas Bachol Mitzvah, is surprising, but very, very far-reaching in its implications. Can everybody hear, by the way, so far? I'm getting a little static, but okay, great. I appreciate the feedback. Okay, so that is one category. That's the view of the Maram Rutenberg, and we'll soon see that in the Ksos HaChoshen's really magnificent presentation of this broader issue, that the Maram's psak, has a lot of currency, is treated, is given the respect and the weight that it deserves. But that represents one category. Sharp contrast to that, we have the view of the Rashba, which we, I think, already read the Rashba's presentation in the Masachet Ksubos, where the Rashba says that when it comes to tzedakah, even though there is kfiyah, there is compulsion, the compulsion does not include confiscation of property at all. It's all about verbal pressure and maybe, physical coercion or physical pressure. But there is no economic aspect of that at all. Even though one would have thought, certainly compared to the cases of the Baden-Württemberg, namely, building a sukkah, daled minim, even hiring, a teacher or paying tuition, if somebody asks me which is more likely to be considered an economic mitzvah, certainly tzedakah might qualify. Although, as we've been discussing, part of the bigger issue is the extent to which tzedakah really is about, the financial support of the aniyim, or what's the point, the opportunity of the donor for the philanthropist, right, to cultivate a perspective of, generosity as part of his quest of imitatio Dei, of imitating the Rabbanu Shalom. So in the world, I'm going to turn to the world of tzedakah. Well, let me say this. There are many people who dispute the Maram's perspective when it comes to regular mitzvos. I think the more typical view is that kofin osel mitzvah saseh is not through financial confiscation, but there is that view of Maram, and because Maram, I say, was so influential, I wouldn't call it an outlying view because it had a lot of impact even in the world of Psak, in the world of Ashkenaz. But relative to, let's say, the majority interpretation of the Gemaras, Maram's position is striking and mechudash, we'll say, innovative. The Rashba's view in tzedakah is equally innovative in the opposite direction. The idea that kfiyah b'tzedakah doesn't mean what it seems to mean, namely that you can confiscate his property, even though the Gemara in Basra says, mimashkin oso afilu be'erev Shabbos. That sounds like you're coming into his home and you're, grabbing, maybe not his kiddush cup, but something in order to force compliance that he should pay his bill or his commitment to tzedakah. The fact that the Rashba is convinced that there's no aspect of confiscation is very significant. When it comes to tzedakah, let's examine that more fully. There are two other shitos. So the middle position is the position of the Rambam. If you look in Hilchos, this goes back to not the Marmakomos you have in front of you, but the one from the previous group, where the Rambam in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, Perek Zayin, Halacha Yud, suggests that when it comes to tzedakah, there is kfiyah, like the Gemara says, but he explicates what that means and what it doesn't mean. He says, nachtinan lenechasav befanav, which means that if the person who's obligated and who is, abstaining, let's say, from fulfilling his obligation, if he is present physically, then if the only methodology to be used to force compliance of his meeting or discharging his obligations is that you confiscate his property, then so be it. However, if he's not present, let's say he's traveling, or let's say, something occurs and he's, not, legally capable of making a commitment or of transacting at that point in time. So the implication of the Rambam is that shalom b'fanav, there is no monetary compensation. And the question is, what is that compromise? Either this is an economic mitzvah, in which case the full wherewithal of a person's owned property should support the discharge of that obligation, or we're taking the view that this is more like a general mitzvah, like let's call it daled minim, or building a sukkah like the Gemaras in Ksubas, which, notwithstanding the exceptional view of the Maram Rottenberg, is something that incites verbal pressure and other such things, maybe even physical pressure, but doesn't reduce to finance it. So why is the Rambam taking the middle position, a position that basically allows for confiscation in the presence of the party who is obligated, but doesn't allow the person's mortgage property or liened property, or even his actual, present property in his physical absence to be confiscated in order to discharge this particular obligation? Why that compromise? We'll see in a moment, because Choshen asks that question. There is a third sheet. So again, so far we've outlined the Rajba believes there's no physical coercion. There's no Gviya min chasav, afilu b'fanav. The Rambam says there's Gviya b'fanav. The Ran in Masachet Ksuvos, very interesting, very gingerly, comes, reaches his conclusion. He starts off by quoting the Rajba, who he dismisses. He thinks that is, far, far too moderate a perspective. There has to be financial coercion of some sort when it comes to implementing the obligation of tzedakah. That is the view of the Ran. He then quotes, seemingly approvingly, the position of the Rambam. But even as he quotes it, the language, again, I'm not going to repeat this because we did this previously. We were talking about 3 Rans and 3 Rajbas and their consistency and how they view mitzvot tzedakah. But the way that he quotes the Rambam begins with approval, and then he's a little bit unsatisfied that the Rambam isn't going far enough. He likes that there's kviya and gviya b'fanav, but he is somewhat nonplussed by the limitation, by the fact that this gviya doesn't extend also to shelo b'fanav. And therefore the Ran, in the end of the sugya, he first, says efshar, and then 4 or 5 lines later, the efshar turns into, mistaber. It seems that certainly his heart led him to think that there's full kviya, meaning that if a person is obligated to give tzedakah, then his property secures that obligation as well. And therefore, if he's not present because he's traveling or for any other reason, then under those conditions, there can be financial confiscation. So those are the 3. If you look at Shulchan Aruch, the issue becomes a little bit complicated. If you look here on page 3 of the present Mar Makomos, and you look at Yordeh Tzedakah 7 Reish Mem Ches Sif Aleph, you will see that the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and this is quite typical, was impacted by the ruling of the Rambam. So he says, this is Sif Aleph, Kol Adam Chayv Litain Tzedakah, Afilu Oni HaMisparnis Minan Tzedakah Chayv Litain Mima Sheyitain Lo, Umisha Nosein Pachos Mima Sheroy Litain, Bezdin Kofin Oso Makin Oso Makas Mardus, Ad Sheyitain Ma Shamdu Litain, B'Yordin L'Nchasav B'Fanav, V'Lokim Mima Sheroy Lo. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that if there's no other recourse, of course, we don't do strong arm tactics in our first effort to convince somebody, to pay his debts, and certainly not somebody to, properly discharge his philanthropic responsibilities. But if there's no other recourse, then Yordan l'nechasav, but the key word here is the fund of, only in his presence, which is what the Rambam says in Perek Zayin, However, if you look at the Shach, next entry, the Shach quotes the Bach. The Bach was the father-in-law of the Taz. The Bach was a very innovative thinker. He, was a bit of an iconoclast. Sometimes saw things differently than everybody else. So did his son-in-law, in a different way, but it was a good match, frankly. Anyways, the Shach quotes the Bach, who says, "The Bach nira sheheven derotz lomer afilu b'fanav ve'im mamtinin ad sheyitain hu ba'atzmo elakivin shelo rotz alitain shuvein shomin lo v'yordin l'nechasav af b'fanav." So the Bach said a very remarkable thing. He took the Rambam's apparent compromise, which is that you can only confiscate property in the presence of the nosein. But if he's not present, then there's no recourse. There's nothing else to do. Instead, the Bach, possibly because he was troubled by what the Ksos later was troubled by, the compromise, like either there's a financial obligation or it's not. If it's a financial obligation, let all the property secure, this obligation. he was troubled by that. So he interpreted very radically that when the Rambam said b'fanav, he meant fila b'fanav. So the real psak of the Shulchan Aruch, according to the Bach, would be that you can confiscate financially if you have no other recourse b'fanav and shelo b'fanav. And the chiddush of b'fanav is that you might have thought that you should be more patient. So if he's there, and you asked him, to comply with his obligation, and he refused. So how much time, has to pass before you can seize and confiscate his property? Should you be working with him as long as he's there? Again, if it's shelo b'fanav, says the Bach, then you just take his money, and that's the end of it. There's no reason to wait. But if he's there, it's unpleasant, and not just unpleasant, it's not the ideal way for the mitzvah of tzedakah to be executed and implemented for various reasons. The adivut and nidivut, the generosity aspect, is an aspect of tzedakah, as we've discussed in these shiurim, and that is compromised or undercut a little bit by confiscation, which is why some people probably think that it doesn't exist at all. Rajba udiime. So the Bach was saying the b'fanav is a filu b'fanav. You might think, well, there's an opportunity here, to keep negotiating with him, to keep pressuring him, and maybe you need the confiscation. And the Rambam is telling you, and the Shulchan Aruch is telling you, that notwithstanding that possibility, at a certain point, just take his property. However, the Shach disagrees. Shach says the linira, the Ratza Lomar Dafka b'fanav, la'fuke im eno kan. The ein yordin l'nechassav ad modina le'imafshar de logara michov. The Shach says, no, that's not the pshat in the Rambam. The real pshat in the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch is that you can only take that is off limits. However, this also is very interesting, and it reflects, again, the ambiguity in the topic and also a bit of halachic / emotional halachic perspective. But again, the idea of coercion, in a matter of philanthropy is very distasteful. So, on the other hand, the need to be able to support to provide the resources that the community requires in order to accomplish its requirements and to safeguard the broader population is a huge pressure. So for that reason, there's a kind of a dialectical tension between the moderate view, we'll call it, and the more hawkish view when it comes to Kviya B'Tzedakah. And of course, the Makoros themselves, as we've seen, lend themselves to various interpretations, and some more than others. And therefore, it's the certainty of which direction to go is unclear. So the Shach here in his commentary in Yoredeya, even as he rejects the Bach, and even as he maintains and sustains the view that the absence of the nosing, that there's not going to be seizure of his property, opens the door by saying,
one of the things
One second, let me just finish the sentence. Let me finish the sentence and then I'll take the question. He says, if the person is absent and you are able to contact him and inform him that you're about to seize his property, that might be acceptable as well. And what I'm going to show you is that the Shach wrote another work called Mikutas HaKesef. That was his footnotes responding to the criticisms, especially the Taz, on his work on Yoredeya. So in the footnotes, he doesn't admit it, but he walks back that qualification. Yeah, what was the question?
Yeah, I just wanted to observe that very often the Torah uses the word vayikach, Korach, etc. And almost invariably, the commentary, Rashi, for example, says that it's bidvarim, with language.
Right.
And that there was a very strong hesitation to interpret phrases of that kind as a physical intervention, either physically or monetarily.
Or economically. Or physically.
Economically.
Right. That's a great point. But, here, since the Gemara says in 2 or 3 different places, in both Basra and Ksuvos and Rosh Hashanah, that there is an aspect of compulsion. So, again, the distaste, which I think you're reflecting, is counterbalanced by the more objective, compelling nature of the evidence itself, and that's why I think you get a lot of attention. But I think your point is a really good point. So the Nekudas HaKesef, the Shach, and the Shach is generally of that generation of poskim. The Shach is considered to be the Machriya B'neihem. He's the Rav Moshe Feinstein, of his time. So most people poskim like the Shach. So in the Nekudas HaKesef, which you also have printed on the page, so I was interested in showing how these nuanced different views all get recorded and registered and argued, even among the most basic poskim. If you take the Bach and the Shulchan Aruch, the Shach and the Nekudas HaKesef. So if you look very carefully, I'm not going to read it now because we're under a little bit of constraints in terms of our mechanisms. But if you go to line 6, the Shach says, "Umashma filahu be'inan shi efshar lahodio tov lamed yom v'kaygavnu nifroim chov shelo b'fanav k'moshe nizbar litzdaka ein magvin the imlokein ein chiluk ben chov litzdaka." Wow. So the Shach says something very important. Number one, he walks back his previous comment that there are circumstances which might justify confiscation shelo b'fanav. And number two, he argues that fundamentally it's not proper to compare collection of tzedakah and collection of a debt. Now, in our travels in this topic, which we've been doing for like 4 weeks, what we've seen is that this is a major, major controversy. The Ra'ah, the Radvaz, we'll see today in the discussion of the Ksos HaChoshen, many of them are arguing precisely that philanthropy, becomes a creditor-debtor paradigm in every way. And what the Shach is saying is, if you were able to confiscate shelo b'fanav, then that would imply that tzedakah is a chov. And in principle, the imlokein ein chiluk ben chov l'tzedakah, that is totally unacceptable position to take. Okay, so the Shach ends up being a hardcore supporter of the distinction of the Rambam, etc. One other shita that I want to talk briefly about the Ksos HaChoshen, who makes some very interesting distinctions. If you look on the next page, page 4, I have presented here the words of the Kesef Mishnah. Kesef Mishnah, of course, is the main, or if not the main, he and the Maggid Mishnah vie for the title of being the most important commentaries on the Rambam's work. But as we know, the added importance of the Kesef Mishnah is that he is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He's the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He wrote the Beis Yosef and he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which was so determinative in Psak Halakha. So what he says really matters. The Kesef Mishnah as a radical reinterpretation of the Rambam as well, according to which, in principle, even the Rambam would agree that there would be Giviyas Tzedakah Shelo B'fanav, that even if the person is not physically present, you'd be able to seize his property. However, says the Kesef Mishnah, this is 3 lines down in the Kesef Mishnah, they have Shalomer Shatam Rabbeinu, and this is a very beautiful, inspiring explanation of the Kesef Mishnah. He was really a humanist. He was really somebody who had great faith in humanity. The assumption should be that a person is interested in philanthropy and he doesn't have to be coerced into it. Of course, there are always individuals who are exceptions to this rule, but that the default assumption in humankind or in Jewish kind or both is that people are interested and enthusiastic even implement and execute their philanthropic obligations. And then he adds, the gam ki mamona shel adam mishubad lasos mimenu tzedakah is a huge leap. And because of that, because of the interest to do that, which of course is based on the Torah's value system and the impact that it has, it's also true that his property is mortgaged or liened, L-I-E-N-E-D, right? Meaning it secures the accomplishment of that goal. So that if he's not present, but there is some wherewithal which could be seized in order to accomplish this goal, you would do it. But then he adds, but how come the Gemara seems to say, which is the Rambam's basis, the Rambam's psak, that if a person is traveling, you're not allowed to seize his property for the purpose of tzedakah. There's the Kesef Mishnah, this is where the optimism comes into play. Because the Kesef Mishnah says everybody got it wrong. All the Mefarshim until this point in history interpreted the Gemara that you can't seize the person's property when he goes traveling because it's not fully an economic obligation, and also because you can't operate against the economic and personal interests of the owner. That would be a kind of act of gezel. However, says the Kesef Mishnah, the real reason why you're not able to seize the property of the traveler is because how do you know the traveler isn't actually performing the mitzvah of tzedakah wherever he is? If he's so enthusiastic, he took his checkbook or his credit card, as the case may be, with him. So instead of assuming that he's negligent and that he's being, he's basically evading his responsibility, why should we assume that he is magnificently executing it wherever he is? In light of this, some of the Mefarshim and Shulchan Aruch tried to explain that there's a fundamental difference between, this case and the case of the Maram Rutenberg. Let's say somebody leaves, his family, and he goes off traveling, and he hasn't paid his tuition obligation to the school. He hasn't been, teaching his child, and he wasn't, hiring, a tutor or paying tuition to the school. And he's off now in Medina Sayyam. What would the Kesef Mishnah say about that case? Says the Ksos HaChoshen, he would agree with the Maram Rutenberg, but not for the reasoning of the Maram Rutenberg, not because any obligation, no matter what, constitutes a financial obligation as well. That's not true. But when it comes to anything having to do with tzedakah, the assumption that this individual is interested, that is the focal point. But if he, if his child remains, in New York City, in Manhattan, and he's off traveling, for whatever good reason, to Colorado, he's not paying his child's tuition bill in Colorado. So if the issue is the economic, the securing of the mitzvah obligation, then it doesn't really make a difference. But if the point, as the Kesef Mishnah suggests, that you can't confiscate property from, or the issue in confiscation, is whether we can presume that he's doing the right thing wherever he is, that only applies to things like tzedakah.
But it
doesn't apply to being.
Isn't the real pressure point on tzedakah is when the ani is in front of him? In other words, a person could be giving tzedakah in the next block. He can go. The pressure point is on him.
Right? But first of all, it's good to hear your voice. I can identify everybody by their voices. It's so good.
Thank you.
Since I know who's speaking, I know you've been to Yerushalayim before.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yes.
You don't live there, but when you're in Yerushalayim, there are plenty of aniyim who are stopping you on the streets.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So what I'm saying is, you're totally right in terms of the lav, and my suggestion, which is that the financial aspect of tzedakah is connected to the lav, not so much to the aseh. That is totally true.
No,
however,
the point I was getting to is
even if that is the case, but I'm saying what the Kesef Mishnah is saying is, who's to say?
No, this I
wherever
understand.
he is,
I'm going back to the previous case where, we're trying to confiscate his property when he's not there. That in itself is counterintuitive to the law, because if he's not there, there, then he doesn't have the pressure point of having to give to that particular cause.
Right. Well, but let's say we're talking about mid-rate tzedakah, or let's say, he made a.
In other words,
or let's say
already, you're saying
shekel. Right. Yeah. Correct. So I'm just going to now move to the Ksos. As you can see, this is like a very lively debate. The Ksos HaChoshen, because of my physical surroundings. In fact, I might lose this connection soon. So I'm not going to do full justice. Maybe next week I'll just physics. I want to wrap up a couple of more things. But let me just tell you what the Ksos does here. The Ksos first begins by attacking what he considers to be the problem of the compromise of the Rambam. How can the Rambam, suggest that there is confiscation b'fanav, but shalom b'fanav, there's no confiscation? Limanushach. Either this is a financial or translates into a financial obligation, or it doesn't. What's the difference whether he's present or not? So this is the difficulty that he has. Basically, what the Ksos says is, I understand the Rashba and I understand the Ran and the Kesef Mishnah. I don't understand the Rambam. It sounds like he's straddling the fence. So he came up with a very brilliant suggestion based on the doctrine of the Ramban in the end of Masachet Bal Basra. In the end of Bal Basra, the Gemara discusses whether Shibuda Doraisa or whether Priyas Bal Chov is a mitzvah. Shibuda Doraisa basically means that one's property backs up or is a lien to whatever financial obligation is incurred. So again, even if that property is subsequently sold to a purchaser, right, the right of first possession, the shibud, the lien, can be taken by, let's say, the lova. However, if you don't hold shibud doraisa, then the lokeach, the purchaser, is off the hook. However, the principle of Priyas Bal Chov mitzvah doesn't mean that you can't seize property from the lova. Everybody agrees you can take his property that has been a chorin, right? Now, if he refuses to pay you back, you can take his property. You just can't take the property that was subsequently sold. But the Ramban says, why is that? After all, in most mitzvos, if you say if Priyas Bal Chov is a mitzvah allows for such kfiyah. So the Ramban says an amazing thing, and maybe this is the basis. Well, he doesn't go as far as the Moran-Württemberg, but it's halfway to the Moran-Württemberg. The Ramban says a very brilliant idea. Mitoch shekofinoso begufo kofinoso v'mamono. Ramban says, listen, the Gemara in Ksuva says that even for lulav and for putting up a sukkah, you can pressure him, and you can apply some physical pressure too, as he is obligated to perform his mitzvah. Again, Har Sinai was a very serious bris, a very serious commitment. Nasa v'nishma wasn't, when I want to. It really is a bris, a commitment, an obligation. Whether you, at the moment are interested or not. So there is kfiyah b'mitzvos. That's Ramban. If there's kfiyah b'mitzvos, financial properties as a lever in kfiyas hagavra, you're not giving him property or confiscating his money because it's an economic obligation completely, or the economic obligation is objective as based on a lien on his property. It's an extension of compelling him in a personal way. Toch shekofinoso begufo kofinoso b'mamono. So the Ksos HaChoshen very brilliantly quotes that Ramban and says that's the pshat in the Rambam's apparent compromise. Why did the Rambam think that there's Geviyah b'fanav, Nachtina l'nichsei b'fanav, but not b'fanav?
Because he's reluctantly saying yes.
It's perceived as Kfiyas Hagavra. It's a lever to force him to discharge his personal obligation. There is no financial obligation, but the finances are not less than physical pressure, and therefore there is this not compromise view, but basically what the Rambam is saying is this isn't a financial obligation, it's a personal one, but finances.
Yeah, but still doesn't answer the question why b'fanav yes and not b'fanav no.
Right, so the answer is as long as it's b'fanav, that the personal aspect of it is clear. In other words, we perceive it as a lever when he's there.
I sort of see a different approach. B'fanav, just like we say kofanos ha'shama rotzani. So we can say that while it's in front of him, once we take it away from him, he really wanted it, so to speak.
Okay, I like that. They're not mutually exclusive.
Approach.
You know what? I think
when he's not there, you can't say that. Right. But when he's there,
I think both things could be true, and they might be overlappingly true. I like it. Very good, Jeff. I mean, that's a solution for the Rambam. I'm not going to have time to finish with the Rebbe, but I just I'll just give you, to whet your appetite with an H. The Ksos goes on to discuss, number one, the problem of Nidrei Tzedakah, and whether Nidrei Tzedakah are the same as the core of something which we've been discussing in various forms. That the way he discusses is very fascinating. It coalesces around a very common and very controversial case of Yerusha. Right, a person makes a neder before he dies, right, to give tzedakah, and then he dies. He hasn't implemented it. Are the heirs, are the yarshim, obligated to carry that, to execute that? Of course, the right thing to do is to execute it. But is that a financial obligation that cuts into their Yerusha or precedes their Yerusha or not? There's a violation that he had, Bal Yachel Devaro, for violating a neder. Is there also a financial component, even to Nidrei Tzedakah, such that the Yarshim must honor
the canyon rim?
That bequest? So that's a very interesting question about mitzvah, Nidrei Tzedakah, and about general tzedakah.
Well, why should his obligation to tzedakah be any worse than if he said, "I want this money given to Mr. Smith," which we would take as an obligation that we must fulfill?
Well, that right. Let's say he did that only with a neder, not with a kinyan. That it would be the same.
But if he's a shchid meirah, then we listen.
Well, no, shchid meirah is a different. Right, we're not going to get that. Shchid meirah is a whole different category. Shchid meirah will make allowance for the person's mental state. Because of his mental state. But this is a little bit different, and so we'll discuss that next week when I think I'm going to be in a funny place next week too, but there shouldn't be a connectivity problem, so everybody should be able to see me. I hope that's good. That's one issue that he discusses. The other issue that he discusses is to compare tzedakah to other cases that are like on the border, where there's an ambiguity whether there really are financial obligations or not. For example, as I indicated earlier, sukkah and lulav are not financial obligations. Buying a shofar in order to fulfill the mitzvah of tkiyah shofar, or buying food in order to eat Erev Yom Kippur, these are not financial obligations. They have a financial, aspect to the implementation of the mitzvah, but they're not financial obligations. Paying back chov, priyas b'chov mitzvah, is a pure financial obligation. Tzedakah is on the border. Nidrei tzedakah is even a little more in the middle on that border. And then there are things like pidyon haben. Right? Pidyon haben is not about really buying your child from a Kohen, but symbolically, and the fact that it revolves around a price tag or erchin, right? We just finished Sefer Vayikra. We read Parshas Bechukosai, the din of erki alai, pidyon, as I say, pidyon haben, hanokas, eved, and ribbis is a great example as well. Like the halach of ribbis is that you're not allowed to charge interest. If you do charge interest, then ribbis ketzutzas yotze, the Gemara says in Bava Metzia, Samech Beis, ribbis ketzutzas yotze b'dayanim, meaning the lova has the right to force the repayment of the ribbis. Now, the malva cannot keep the ribbis even though it was given voluntarily. However, the Gemara says something else, and that is apropos to the larger question, the Tshuvas Harama, the question of honoring the bequest of a father by his heirs. The Gemara says that the yarshim of the lova do not have the right to get a return of the rivas ketzutza. Only the lova himself. So the Ksos discusses, should we compare tzedakah and nidrei tzedakah to pidyon haben, to anakas eved, to erchin, or maybe it's more comparable to ribis ketzutza. The common denominator in all these cases, that's why it's such a fascinating paradigm, is that all these are gray area ambiguities. They express themselves in a monetary way, but of course, the mechayiv, the conceptual significance in many cases, is the aspect of chesed, or the case of nadarim, the commitment, and so on. So the fact that there is a primary monetary application does that dictate that it becomes a financial obligation to the point of either saying that you could totally confiscate even shalom b'fanav based on the principle of shibudim, or if not that, at least the middle position of the Rambam of gvia b'fanav, whether it's based on the Ksos's expansion of the Ramban's bitok shmeo b'gufo kofeo b'mamono, or whether it isn't a more moderate form of confiscation, in its own right. So I want to discuss that next week because they're really important categories. It represents almost like a halakhic philosophy of what constitutes, categories of mitzvahs. What's a financial mitzvah, and what are the consequences of attaining that status? Okay, so I hope for better technical mechanisms next week, although they probably won't be perfect either. And I think we have next week and the week after to wrap up some issues before we break. Everybody should have a wonderful week. I hope everybody had a terrific Shavuos, and we look forward to the visual contact as well. Next week.